I'm looking at pictures of the Republican Party as the Trump inauguration has happened, and we're starting to see pictures of people on the internet identifying as Republicans, and it strikes me because traditionally I have seen a much different face of the Republican Party. So this is a picture of Steve Bannon and what is it? Presser? Is that who else is sitting here, Lucas?
Scott Presler, Scott Presler is a member of the Republican Party of the uh, of the of the party apparatus right now. I don't know what his actual title is, but he created an application and has been instrumental in registering new Republicans and working with the Republican Party to build a Republican base in the last couple of elections.
And this is what I would have traditionally thought the Republican Party would have looked like as I was at national conventions or whatever. I saw people that looked a lot like this, and I almost never saw people that looked like uh, Steve Bannon and Scott Presler. So this is definitely something which has changed, and I think very recently in the last couple cycles is when we've started to see this different face on the Republican Party.
Yeah, and hair is important, whether it be on their face or whether it draped down past their shoulders. But there was a time whenever Steve Bannon and Scott Presler would have been relegated to the sidelines if allowed on the stage at all or on the field at all simply because of their hair. And look at that Carhart jacket, and oh my God, an open, no tie, open shirt collar. Goodness me, what's happening? What's happening? Um,
This is the same thing that Fetterman gets into trouble for when he's walking around with his hoodie and his short pants and what have you.
Absolutely, and it's I have expectations that John Fetterman, senator from Pennsylvania, is going to be uh, joining the Republicans, and I don't think it has to do with our traditional ideas of who makes up those parties or what interests make up those parties. I think there is a move of populism that spans across them. Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have have some different solutions for things going on in America today, but they're also in some ways talking about some of the same problems, and and those problems are or the problems that they're addressing are being backed by a populist movement in the United States. And so we're seeing the interests of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, the big business interests, the large corporation interests, the globalist interest being shoved to the sideline. And in some ways, this gets pitched to us as nationalism, ugly nationalism, um, tougher politics. But uh, we cannot deny that the bourgeoisie, the blue collar Americans have been ignored for a number of election cycles.
I
50
can't
ter-
imagine that they're going to take kindly to this. I mean, these guys don't go out without a fight, right? So they can't be happy about this. I know they weren't happy with Trump taking the helm for a very long time, but that was inevitable in this cycle. But are these guys receding to the background, or are they biding their time, waiting to resurge and take the take this back over?
Well, I think the election in 2020, the censorship that the government has engaged in is a sign of that fight. And not only that, but the the scope of the wars that America has engaged in, and our coups across the world at one time were more rare and more furtive, but they have become more open and protracted, visible. Um, we also sanction the whole world around now. Over half the world population is under sanctions for the use of the American dollar. So I see those as the desperate attempts of the corporate interests, the financial interests that had dictated the Republican Party, even the Democratic Party. They have been cornered, and that's part of the reason that we've seen um, immoral efforts that we had foisted on other countries of the world for so long turned on ourselves. And Trump signed 78 executive orders. Um, we talked about some of them the other day. We
Was,
didn't
was
mention.
that was that the was that the count 78, or is it
Yeah, I
still
think
timing?
it was 78 on the first day, but he's signed many more since then. And uh, that's also part of this fight over the federal government, this fight over the bureaucrats that exist at the lower levels. But no, we have seen this ugly fight playing out for quite some time. The election of Donald Trump um, was maybe the pendulum beginning to swing the other way towards the populists. Um, if Bernie Sanders had been elected when he ran against Hillary Clinton, we might have seen this play out differently with the populists taking control of the Democratic Party and exerting their agenda from the Democratic Party. But instead,
Well, I'll
uh,
tell you what, I've seen a resurgence of that particular idea. Many are saying that that was one of the that's one of the course corrections that needs to happen in the Democratic Party as they lick their wounds and try and figure out what went wrong in this last election cycle. Many are pointing at the squashing of the Bernie Sanders group as being, the primary driver for how they lost so spectacularly, because they don't have their own populist movement to counteract this.
yeah, and in the last election, I constantly waited for some Democratic politicians to begin to articulate the the populist values. But instead they were doubling down. I mean, they ran to Liz Cheney. They ran to the machine that supports the American global empire, and and that had everything to do. I mean, turn back and also look at uh, at the characters who were put into place in the Democratic, policy. Like they may have had an illusion of diversity, but was John Fetterman put at the front of the party with his hoodie and his shorts? No, they were well dressed and uh, not hirsute, long haired hippies. The long haired hippies, the long mittened hippies
Yeah,
were.
it's almost like we've seen a flip. It used to be that you would consider the Democrats to be more of the populist, the long-haired, the organic, food-eating, anti-establishment. What is going on here? Like that we've it's almost like these two parties have completely flipped their public personas. It is the counterculture was firmly rooted with the Democrats, but with their rejection of Bernie and his crew, like yeah, I guess the suits took over the Democrats.
Well, we take this language of the left and the right, and the metaphor as if there's some sort of straight line of policy agendas. We take it from Britain, but we have a different political system here, and I like to point out that the Democrats are originally a party that was concerned with exerting their agenda at the state level, Republicans at the federal level. And so you can have people who agree on the values and the way that the world should be, but disagree at what level that should be applied. And and I think that part of what we're seeing here with the Republican Party and the shift that they've made, as they are against the deep state or the bureaucratic state, the moves that Trump has already made against the federal government, that they are trying to get away from reliance on the federal government to enforce their agenda. And it's I if they can maintain that tack, then I think that they will see Democrats, populist Democrats or leftist, quote unquote leftist Democrats, start to leave the Democratic Party and join them. And but the other thing that I worry that we will see in the Trump administration is that they rely too heavily on the bureaucratic state, on the Department of Justice, the CIA, the FBI, to enforce their agenda. And if they do so, then they will be entrapped by the machine that they try to defeat. And if we take a look back into history, we can see that this has happened before. This is not the first time that the Republican Party and the Democratic parties have had an identity crisis. And when the Republican Party was first created, it was called the Radical Republican Party. But after the Civil War ended and the Republicans won the Civil War, and also had also won other wars, not least against many wars against indigenous Native American peoples, and they began to apply their agenda on the West, and they became a party of railroads and big business, just like we see them today. And that those railroads and big business interests were later stretched around the world for the quote unquote globalist agenda. But they had a crisis in the 1890s, and they began to question the fairness and the allegiance and the power of the railroads. And that's whenever they became the Progressive Republican Party. And many of them sneer at the word progressive today, but progressivism was a a movement in the Republican Party, and it was also one in which they redefined liberalism, because they love to talk, and we like to talk about our libertarian ideals here, but there was a time whenever the notion that citizens enforced their liberty became, the federal government enforces the liberty of citizens, and that was the wake of Teddy Roosevelt and his trust busting and some of the policies that went on there. So, when Donald Trump renamed or signed an executive order to rename Denali Mount McKinley, I thought that very interesting because President McKinley, William McKinley, figured greatly in that change from radical republicanism to progressive republicanism. And not only that, but William McKinley was shot. He was assassinated. And I thought it fascinating that Donald Trump has. I wondered how much McKinley was on his radar beforehand, because McKinley was also about moving off of the federal income tax and looking outside of the United States to pay for the to pay for the policies or the bills of the federal government. So he was all about tariffs, and he was shot, and after he was shot, who came on the scene but Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, he's got to be thinking about people getting shot, since he's had shots taken at him. That's got to be part of the reason why they weren't outside for the inauguration. I mean, I know the official line was that it was too cold outside, but it's got to be security related.
Absolutely. It was 100% security related. And, for many reasons. I mean, like, we have legacy wars that he's walking into. He has Donald Trump has been very assertive in reaching a ceasefire in the Palestine-Israel war. He's been trying to find one with Ukraine, but there are many places around the world where we've relied on aggression and force to have our way in the world. So I think Trump has been wary of that, but also maybe on a larger level, the domestic unpopularity and the division that we see in the United States. I think that's a higher security threat. When I also look back at the 1890s, at McKinley, at Teddy Roosevelt, I think too about the Spanish-American War about the United States beginning to reach outside of the, in the wake of the Civil War, they reached westward to finance political agendas, especially in the East. And as the population of the United States spread westward, they had to reach outside the country. Um, Teddy Roosevelt, before he came to power, fought in Cuba, and it's fascinating to me that Cuba also continues to play so prominently in American foreign policy, and it's a tiny island off of Florida. Um, but not, I mean, Donald Trump didn't just rename Denali. He also made statements about the Panama Canal. Who built the Panama Canal? Teddy Roosevelt. At that time, whenever progressive Republicans were looking to federal government to make lives better for Americans, but they were doing so at the cost, or looking outside of America rather than figuring out how to come to political arrangements, agreements for who was sharing or giving up what inside the United States. So I'm not sure where Donald Trump goes with Greenland and Panama, but Teddy Roosevelt, he said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," but I worry that we live in a world where other countries have carved out some bigger sticks of their own, and hate to see a fight start there. The other thing that was going on in that era that I find also maybe the most interesting was arguments about money. And as the country turned towards progressive republicanism, populism and progressive republicanism, there was a huge argument about what type of money the United States should be on.
Like hard money versus soft money.
Absolutely. And we talked today about the gold standard, and we idealized the gold standard, but this is at a time before they had settled on the gold standard. And weirdly enough, although people might tell you today that gold is hard money, the gold standard is not hard money. There's a difference between being on gold and being on a gold standard. And the difference is fractional reserve banking, or saying, oh, we're going to print more paper money than we have for gold. And if you step into the difference between hard money and soft money, by the way, goes to supply. And so if you hear hard and soft money, think about the difference of sitting down at a game of Monopoly and there being a fixed amount of money in the game, and you sit down and property begins to be traded, and dice are rolled, and the game goes on and on. And then think about how differently the game would play if there was constantly a little bit more money over there in the bank. And that difference plays out largely in terms of debt and people coming to the game later. Because if there's constantly a little bit more money going on, then one, holding debt is a benefit, because if you go into debt and there's more money in the future, then when you pay off that amount in the future, it's less of a percentage of the total supply.
Yeah, this has traditionally been something that big debt holders, and that was usually farmers who would go into debt for either buying land or for the expansion of their operations. They wanted an inflationary monetary supply. They did not want hard money because it made it a lot harder to deal with the debt, because you didn't have an expectation of more money over time. You actually might have the expectation of less money over time because you might be in a deflationary style economic system.
Exactly. And so at the time, you saw the railroads and the bankers who wanted to see the United States on gold. And in an argument of saying, oh, we should be on some sort of valuable item, the populace, the farmers, and the workers of America who wanted to take on debt so they and have an inflationary currency so they could, get into a house and pay it off in time, um, and have those payments be less in the future. They said, oh, we should be on silver too, because there's a lot more silver in the world, and that can give me an option of two different types of money. I can be on gold or silver. And this was called bimetallism. The bankers didn't want to see silver because there was too much of a supply of it, and they would lose too much control. And so part of the detente that you see coming out of that becomes the gold standard. And we have these narratives about the Federal Reserve and the banking cabal, but part of the reason that we see a compromise made on the gold standard instead of gold and silver is that, we can, if we're on the gold standard, we can have an inflationary currency, paper money, that is laid on top of something that's not inflationary, and the bankers retain control of that. So, this is at a time too, whenever we see William Jennings Bryan in the Cross of Gold speech, which I recommend everybody listen to at some point, and to think about this, how money affects debt, and how money affects the way that we live, or inflationary money affects the way that we live. But William Jennings Bryan says, "You shall not crucify man on a cross of gold, mankind on a cross of gold." And so it's interesting to see
Well,
today.
just to compare it to today, if Bitcoin is the next evolution of gold and the hardest money that's ever been created, when are we going to get our "You shall not crucify us on a cross of Bitcoin"?
Well, I think that we're already seeing that, and I don't know. This is why I am circumspect about the future of MicroStrategy, because MicroStrategy is not a government entity, and you have this political phenomenon that people aren't going to support what they don't see as fair entry for themselves. So when the Bitcoin is an alternative to the dollar, and anyone can get their hands on it, yay, that's a populist cause. But at the moment that big business begins to accrue too much of it, and large numbers of people do not have, or do not think that they have fair access to it, or an equal amount of access, or parity in it, then they're going to turn on it. And when they turn on it, there are alternatives.
That's when MicroStrategy gets its comeuppance. That's when the hue and cry to nationalize MicroStrategy and to take control of the Bitcoin that they've amassed will finally be enacted.
Yes, and Michael Saylor goes from being painted as a hero to be painted as a villain, and meanwhile nothing has changed, and he is.
This is the constant cycle of history right here.
Absolutely, and I mean nothing against Michael Saylor. I think that he means well, but um, but this, the crowds and the masses, they want what's best for them, and as as the access and the fairness of that system changes, they are going to change against it. So
It reminds me of that quote: "A democracy can last so long as the people don't realize that they can vote the treasury into their own hands," or however that went.
I don't know who made that quote. Sounds like Benjamin Franklin.
I'm
Uh,
gonna see if I can find it quick, but keep going.
See if you can find it. So anyway, we come to this point today where, yes, Bitcoin has become the hardest of monies. If the supply of 21 million can be maintained, um, then it remains the hardest of monies. But there are other things that have gone on to confuse us, is as we have moved over to the gold standard, or the quasi gold standard, because as we all know, the United States has printed more dollars than the gold that we have. We talk about fiat today. Fiat is just this notion of paper money laid on top of something. Aha. Um, I've never even heard of this person, Grant Alexander Fraser Titler. Um,
But you're
So
familiar with the quote, though, right? I mean, this one sort of floats around in the ether. Well, at least maybe it does in the circles that I run in.
I don't know that I've ever seen this quote before, but um, I like it. I like it. So look at that, from bondage to spiritual faith, fiat. Um,
Yep, until they can vote themselves the largesse from the public treasury. And I,
well,
I
and
feel I feel like that's what's been going on here. We just have like various parties that are just lining up to fill their pockets and promising big benefits to various individuals, and it's just a cycle of who's got their hand out to big daddy government here.
well, and I think what we're going to see here, especially in the Trump era, is we're going to see a devolution of power, a devolution of treasury. Already, Trump looks. I mean, unless something changes, as Trump looks to tariffs and looks outside the country um, to finance the United States government, the federal government. We're already seeing states balk at the immigration, and part of immigration that plays into this is also figuring out, the ugly political questions whenever you get down to a hard money or a fixed supply of money. If you can't manipulate the money supply and pump more money into it, or abuse the ignorance of individual people, um, then you have to start deciding who gets to sit at the monopoly table. And that's part of what we're seeing with the fight over immigration, the fight over birthright citizenship, already here in a couple of days into Trump's presidency. And that's a really hard, or I should say, that's a hard fight at any level. But as you deal with larger populations and larger areas of land, it's a harder fight. And this is part of why I look to the original limitation of the federal government to commerce, and some of these decisions to be decided at smaller political sizes, states or counties or municipalities. And I think that was a pretty good system. And we're probably going to wind up back at that system, because some of these questions are nobody's going to be satisfied at magnitudes of 360 million or 8 billion. So,
I know one
but
of the
what,
things that you brought up was Henry George. How does he play into this?
Henry George, I think, is a fascinating populist in the history of the United States. I've mentioned Monopoly. Monopoly is a game that was created by a follower of Henry George, of Lizzie. Now I can't remember her name, but a school teacher who liked the ideas of Henry George. But Henry George essentially gets down to these notions of land and natural resources, maybe physiocratic notions of where money and fairness should come from. Henry George was the man who talked about taxing land and taxing property, and building the political structure from those. And remember, this is again in the wake of the Civil War. Um, Henry George lived through the creation of the income tax to pay for both, not only the income tax, but first of all the airdropping of paper money, the greenbacks to pay the Union soldiers, and the nationalization of the banking system
I
to
still love that phrase every time you say it, that there were airdrops that were happening in 1865. Love that.
absolutely 1861 and 1862, massive airdrops. Print a bunch of paper, hand it around. It's like giving out stamps and saying, we'll figure this out later, and we're going to
US
figure this.
dollar and the greenbacks, the original shit coin.
Those are strong words. But there also figures into this the income tax, because the income tax comes around after William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, says, "Oh, let's accrue a massive amount of debt that we have to force on the states, and the states are going to force that on foreign countries. And whenever we are raising tariffs on foreign countries, it will drive down our foreign trade. And if we isolate the United States, then the plantation owners, the cotton producers of the South, no longer have such strong economic incentives to continue to engage in chattel slavery. And so if we raise tariffs against Great Britain and France and Western Europe, it'll drive down trade there, and then we can finally solve this issue. But it didn't turn out that way. And instead of raising those tariffs, we started an income tax. And so Henry George saw all of this, and he said, this is unfair. This you can abuse the value of land and property, and you can do so in a way that stretches across regional interests and regional differences whenever you're operating the government off an income tax. He said it's very important that we get back to building government off of the nuance of regions. And so anyway, he brought us the game of Monopoly. I still think his ideas are very valid and something that we need to look to. And again, Trump is talking about getting rid of the income tax, but if he's getting rid of the income tax and turning back to the tariff, I don't know how well that's going to work. And that was the path of William Seward. Perhaps he needs to be looking at Henry George instead.
Yeah, tariffs traditionally were something that encouraged local production, because then if you have goods that are coming in from overseas that may be cheaper than the ones that are produced locally, then the tariffs can normalize that out and make it so that the locally produced goods are cheaper. But if we're in a nation and we largely haven't been producing as many goods, we've been net importing goods, then tariffs make goods more expensive, just the stuff that you're normally going to buy.
Well, and absolutely true. But as if we think of alternatives that can happen, especially in the world of more sophisticated technological solutions like public blockchains and public ledgers, and again, like not to take too many loops back into history, but when going into the fight over gold and silver and bimetallism and that national banking system, there were regional banks, but and this Georgian concept of the value of local economies being established by the agricultural and industrial interest in that area, that did exist, and there were local banking systems that were built on top of that. But it was difficult to travel around and to carry, say, money from Minnesota down to Texas, because there was communication issues with the soundness of and the trustworthiness of the various regional banks. Money depreciated as you went further and further from the source, and so this is why the national banking system was attractive. But we can get around that now. And this is where I think Trump should, and I hope that he is looking as he looks towards crypto and looks towards, Henry Georgian or physiocratic notions of building political monies off of local industry and local resources. The other thing that I think gets interesting too, as the Republicans turned from radical to progressive and changed their concepts of the enforcement of liberty from the individual at that radical notion, the individual enforces liberty, to the state enforces liberty. And this is when you get the trust busting, Theodore Roosevelt, and you get, where does the FBI and the Department of Justice, when are they established? They're established by progressive Republicans. And they're established because they say, oh, well, we've created this monster in big business after we created a national currency, that we also need to make these federal watchdogs to bring them down. But that hasn't been the way of it. What we've seen is that big business begins to put the federal institutions under their thumb, and there to be an unholy alliance between them. So this is something else that I hope that the Trump administration, takes into consideration as they talk about, fixing the lawfare and the the excesses that the Democrats and rhino Republicans of the past have engaged in. And we also talked earlier in the episode about debt and how small farmers and for people of lesser means, of the lower classes, how debt is a boon whenever you have a soft currency, and that still remains true. I mean, if you want to get ahead in the American system today, you go out and buy a house. When you go out and buy a house, though, you're not actually buying it, but you are taking on a large amount of debt. And part of the way the system worked for boomers and the Great Generation was they could go out and buy a house, and when they paid it off in the future, it cost less. But that system has been upset because when we look at again businesses or the rich taking advantage of that system, this is why we have to look at private equity, and we have to look at who gets to take out a great amount of debt in our system today. And I hear politicians all the time talk about
at what interest rate. I think that's another key part of it is
absolutely.
if you can borrow a large amount of money at almost no cost to you, like the interest rate is very, very low, or it's disparate. Like if some people are getting these sweetheart deals on interest rates, then they can go and swoop up assets and they can take over things in a way that just seems so like blatantly unfair once you start to dig into that disparity.
Absolutely. And this is something that we don't hear either party talk about, because all of them talk about wanting to promote small business. I mean, listen back to Sarah Palin and Sarah Palin talking about Main Street. I'm tired of Wall Street. I want to help Main Street. But that's political rhetoric, and so is small business, because we need to be careful about how we're measuring small businesses. Democrats and Republicans both love to talk about helping small businesses, but when they're talking about helping small businesses, they're talking about small business measured by the number of owners. And this is why private equity is private equity means that it's not a corporation that's undergone an IPO or is engaging in capitalism, having a whole bunch of people in a voting system that are pooling their money together to create a corporation. And so when we talk about government turning around and benefiting small business, we need to have politicians that are sensitive to measuring the small business by the number of employees, or I mean, honestly, I think measuring it by employees is the best metric. But we haven't seen that yet. And so this is also reasons that I have concern about Trump's policies and how they're going to turn around and help regular Americans. So that's I think that's about it. Any questions for me before I know I talked a lot about history and obscure things, hard money and soft money, but I think these are important things to bear in mind as we see the Trump administration start to tackle problems that we've seen again and again in our past in America.
I think it's one of the most critical things that we can do is to continuously look to history, make sure that we firmly understand things that have happened in the past, things that have been tried in the past, and where we may be just repeating the same things that have happened, so we can see, well, this is how it's likely to play out. If we do the same thing, we're likely to get a very similar result. So personally, I always love getting a historical perspective. Today is a bit more of a tour through history and some of the things that have happened in the past and how it rhymes with what's happening today. No particular questions. We're at the top of the hour. Loved having this discussion on FOMO. If you've liked what you've heard today, really encourage everybody who's listening to check out our YouTube channel. It's where you can find all of our archived episodes. You can find that at FOMO the Show. on YouTube. So check it out and give a like and subscribe. There's a link on my profile. Also, I believe there's one on Lucas's profile, and then we've got FoMO the Show Twitter account. So like and subscribe if you like what you heard here